and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Maddie Dimmick, the Marketing Specialist here at Core Business Solutions. To successfully pass a CMMC assessment, you'll not only need to have the right technologies, but also follow the right processes. But you'll have to show your compliance through documentation. The CMMC assessors have been trained that if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. Proper documentation will be one of the major focuses during your CMMC assessment. We would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for promoting this event today. We have numerous MEPs and PTACs who are now known as Apex Accelerators co-sponsoring our webinar today. Your local Apex Accelerators are available to bridge the gap between your business and the government. Apex Accelerators are here to assist you with local, state, and federal contracting. MEPs provide the tools and resources to help U.S. manufacturers succeed. Each center connects manufacturers with government agencies, universities and research facilities, and trade associations that foster growth and innovation. Contact your local Apex Accelerator or MEP for more information on how they can help your business succeed. We have two industry experts on CMMC here with us today. Scott Dawson is president of Core Business Solutions and has headed up the development of Core's cybersecurity programs for NIST, CMMC, ISO 27001, and other compliance requirements. Rick Crick is the Director of Security Solutions here at Core and has been keeping up with all of the latest changes and updates to CMMC to share those with you. Thanks to the both of you for joining us here today. Excited to dive into this discussion about documentation. To start us off, Scott, you have some updates from the DoD regarding CMMC's next steps. Do you mind sharing those with us today?
Yeah, glad to do it, Maddie, and welcome everyone. Well, I guess the latest news as CMMC makes its way through the bowels of the government is that the CMMC rulemaking process has proceeded to the next step. This is a major step, major phase in the release of a new regulation at the federal level. I didn't know anything about this until I started following the CMMC, but the CMMC rule has been sent over to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, called OIRA, which is the first step in officially and formally making CMMC a federal regulation. So this puts CMMC on a path toward the final rule and regulations being released in the fall of 2024. So it looks like we're a year out from starting to see CMMC as a requirement in federal contracts. I suppose there is a chance it would happen sooner, but that's what we're hearing at this point is most likely. So that means that CMMC is becoming closer to becoming the law of the land here in the United States and for being a DoD federal contractor. So it's important that everyone kind of stays on top of the timing of this. But at the same time, I know you are here today to figure out what you can be doing now to prepare. And I guess that's the real message here, is that there's no reason to wait to prepare because this is complicated. There's a lot of detail. Mm-hmm. As you know, in this series that we provide every month, we try to break things down into bite-sized pieces. Today we're biting off documentation.
Yeah, so documentation is one of those things that I think companies can do to start working on preparing for the CMMC assessments coming up. So Scott, then why is documentation so important to managing security and security compliance?
Yeah, good question, Maddie. It's before we get to the what, we'll start with the why. And of course, we know that documentation is one of the requirements to be certified. So I guess that's part of the why. So we'll put that under the heading of evidence of compliance. You can demonstrate your compliance by having documentation. But it also provides guidance and reference, say, for your managers, for your technology vendors, for your employees who need to have information to refer to in terms of how you manage your security within your organization, within your technologies and how you protect this sensitive CUI from the government, controlled unclassified information. It also helps you to prepare for an audit. So by just the fact of reading through and preparing each of the documents, which Rick will be kind of walking us through here in a minute, but just the fact of reading and preparing those has you think through each step of preparation. It's not the whole thing, but it is a little bit like a checklist as you work through your documentation and implement properly. It helps along those lines. It also helps when things change. So if in your organization, as you know, people's relying on everyone's memory or relying on verbal announcements, even email announcements, when something changes isn't always very reliable. People don't always remember or they misunderstand. So it certainly helps with changes. It kind of documents that there was a change made and when it was made, things like that. Helps to hold people accountable because now you have policies and procedures within your organization. And then finally, I would say training and awareness, great benefit there because this is a lot of technical information that different individuals are going to have to be familiar with and aware of, and having written policies and procedures and other documents can really help people to understand what controls are in place and what their responsibilities are.
Yeah. We have one question from an audience member that I think would be important to cover before we move too far into our discussion today.
Okay.
They asked, who is this topic relevant to? Every business owner or certain industries or audiences?
Yeah, great. It is a great question. So CMMC is the next regulation from the DoD for suppliers in the defense industry. So if you supply any parts or services, any components or products to either directly to the Department of Defense or to a prime contractor or second tier contractor, anywhere in the supply chain, if you're making parts that go to the Department of Defense, then you're obligated to meet requirements that are in contracts today, referred to as DFARS regulations. Those will become CMMC requirements, which is why we talk about that. So if you're doing work with anywhere within the defense industrial base, then this is relevant, and it's important to be educated and be prepared.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott. So then, Rick, would you be able to tell us what types of documentation and what documents are really required for the CMMC
Yeah, love
assessment?
to do that, Maddie. There are a number of documents that are required by the DoD, whether it is the NIST 800-171 or the CMMC. One of the key documents is the System Security Plan, the SSP. That document is what describes what controls we have in place and how are we meeting these particular controls or practices for the DoD requirements. Along with that is what we call a POAM, the Plan of Action and Milestone documents. That would be those items or those practices or controls that we currently don't have in place, but we will have them in place in some time in the future. So NIST allows for POAM items, whereas the CMMC expects you to have all the practices or controls in place. So that would be one of the first documents you'd want to have, followed by policies. Policies are important. There are 14 families or 14 domains for the CMMC and NIST, making up the 110 controls. And the way we have it configured, and many people have it configured, is they have a policy per family of controls. So there's a minimum of 14 policies that they would have. Anything from access control policy, which would help define who has permissions to access your system. who both internally and remote access to your system. There is an identification and authentication policy talking about the authentication. Who has privileges to access our system? And then you have maintenance policies, which dictate, or explain how do we keep our organizational system, our network up to spec. How do we, handle our patching of our products, or staying current with, our antivirus, or those type of things. And then there's always that configuration management policy, kind of mentioning a few of these policies, which tell us how we establish baselines for things like hardware or software within the organization, putting that baseline. So those are a couple of the policies examples for us. So we move from policies to procedures. There's a number of procedures that you would have. Once again, they can be written, or they can be a form of some type. Some of those procedures might be your risk management procedure. How do we handle risks within the organization that relate to security? Any kind of a breach or a change in our environment, is there a risk to making that change? Also, we have an incident response. If we have an incident, how do we respond to that? Who do we talk to? Who do we contact? Procedures dealing with change management. It's important to identify how our changes created or done or implemented within an organization. So we want to make sure that everybody is aware if a change happens, that you're not surprised. And it could, once again, lead to a risk management, determining if I make this change, what's my risk associated with it. So some of these procedures kind of link together as you go through here. Another set of documents that are really important, one of the first documents that you'll be asked in a readiness review, and we'll talk about that later, would be your network diagram. They want to know what is in scope and what's out of scope in your network. So a network diagram helps you identify those boundaries, where your CUI resides, how it flows through your organization, who has access to it. Part of that then it flows right into the data flow diagram, showing us within a network, how does CUI flow within my organization? Who has access to that CUI? And where does it reside? Where does it rest? And those type of things. So those two are really important documents. So we can move on then to records. Once again, records are really important in this whole process. They provide evidence that we are meeting the requirements, that we are actually doing what we say we're going to do. Records, some of the records might be security logs, or they might be server logs, they might be access logs, whatever we're doing, maintaining within our network, and even with our physical facility, maintaining those logs as well. So we need to keep records of logs, would be one example there. Also our maintenance, we talked about maintenance policies, maintaining records, showing that we are keeping things up to date, that patches are current, antivirus definitions are up to date, and so forth. So once again, we're keeping records, we're keeping documents, showing that evidence that we're meeting those particular controls that have been outlined by the DoD. So those are just a few of the documents there that are important to us, that we need to maintain as we want to strive for compliance to both the NIST 800-171 and the CMMC.
Yeah, and we had a question, I think this is really good too, from one of the audience members. They asked if there's a difference between which documents are required for each level.
Which documents are required for each level?
Like level 1, 2, or 3?
Yeah, well, level 3 isn't completely defined. I saw some information about the documents, the levels there. Level 1 is dealing with the 17 controls. Level 2 is what we're talking about here with the 110. So the documents, I think all these documents are applicable in one way or another. Maybe not all of them, but certainly for like a level 1, access control is going to be a basic requirement. So you'd have a policy there. Level 2, the ones that we talked about for each one of the families are important. Level 3, which is higher, once again, you'd have to have the same type that you'd have for level 2 at a very minimum there.
Okay, great. Well then, do you mind showing us a few examples of what documentation looks like? Okay,
so if we're looking at some of the documents, let's take one access control document. In there, we break that down into different areas where we are defining, what's the purpose of this document, who is the owner of that document, and then we break that down and describe how do the practices within that family, how are they generally being met for that. Okay?
Yeah.
So let me show you some of this. We're looking at the resource library, right?
Yes. Yep.
And let's see if you have that up here. Let's look at this.
This
and we'll
is
look at some of
within-
these in detail, some of what I've just explained to you. This is our core compliance platform. This is how we manage our documents. We have what we call a resource library that has the majority of the documents that you would need in order to be compliant with both the NIST 800-171 and the CMMC. So let me open that up. You can see here I have the core resource library, which we provide. I'm going to go to the documents section because that's what we're talking about today. And once again, you have filters here. We can filter by various things. I'm going to sort by title here. And here you have the first one we were talking about, the access control. And I kind of walked through that. Now let me just show you that here. So you can see what I was talking about, generally speaking. You can see the controls or practices listed both for the CMMC and for the NIST. We have a purpose, scope, policies, responsibilities, all the things I was mentioning. And then here we go through and we have an explanation of, how this policy is meeting the various practices or controls listed here. So this would be an example of one of the family of controls that would be available. And you notice there's yellow highlights. So we provide the baseline. This is just a baseline. You build from this per your particular network configuration. So let me close out of that. So you can see there are a number of what we call control policies that give you a starting point as we go through here. There also is, as we get down here, we can look at other areas which are talking about some of the training that we have available, and we'll talk a little bit about those, but we have some text here for an overview. Let's just pull one up. Let's say the 3.7 family of controls. So we have some documentation here that we can look at. So training is important to understand the controls in order to implement them correctly. So these documents give you a description of, what is the standard asking you, and So we go through and try to explain it in plain English for everyone to understand. We talk about how can it be satisfied, and what's the impact? What are they asking for? Why is it important? How can it be satisfied? So there are this training documents we have within our system. In addition to that, we also have training videos that are associated with that. So those are some things that we have, and I think I just closed my application. Let me open this back up for you.
And what kind of training, can you explain a bit more what training is available?
Well, let me cover that while Rick logs in, just to help my partner here. The training we include with the core platform walks not only through each family and what kind of overview is with regard to the 14 families or domains, but we also go into each of the 110 controls one by one and explain what is required, what are they going to look for when they do the assessment, what are some ways in which you can implement the technical or organizational practices that might be needed as well. So it's really nice because it's as you need to go through the training, it's right there available, topic by topic, and then for that, in fact, document by document as you work through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we went here, this green question mark, you can see we were talking about the resource library. Here is the Core Learning Center. And as I bring that up, you'll see one of the nice things that we do is we try to make things as easy as possible for our clients. And if I go in here to the NIST CMMC training, we have two different types of training here. One for what we call the executive. That's for management who doesn't necessarily want to go through all the details, but wants a general idea what we're talking about. And then we have the training that we would have for a person wanting to identify what those controls are and looking at them one by one. For example, the 3.1. You can see we have a video here that you could go through to learn more about that particular training that we had here. In addition to that, let me go back here. And let's see, here we go. With that, then the training is one aspect of it, helping you with the controls. We talked about the procedures as well. And so what we have for those are what we call auto forms. Let me see, let me get to that here real quick. And here you'll see there are what we call auto form. It's a type of procedure. And let's look at one of these. So it automates that process. So you'll see here, this is a security instance. We have a blank template that we start with. Let me show you one that's filled in here. Let me see. We have different fields that you would fill in. You would talk about an incident, the details, investigation, and so forth. So there are fields here that really is a procedure. It walks you through step by step. How do you do this and what do you need to do? And it has mandatory fields. So that would be one example. Another example would be risk management. That's a biggie that you'll want to keep in mind. So, whether it is, here's an example of one that was filled out, talks about a description, and then it ranks the issue. Is it an issue that is important that we have to mitigate? Can it be accepted? So there are various areas here, fields that would walk you through the evaluation and completion of that. So it is we call them an auto form. It is a type of procedure that is automated, if you will. So that is really helpful for us. Some of the things, how we handle it.
Yeah.
Certainly you could have written procedures as well that would accommodate those. But that's a little bit how we handle it. And then always you want to maintain training records.
Yeah.
Those are important to maintain. The appropriate training records for the appropriate people, depending what they have access to.
Because the auditor is going to want to look at that too, right?
Auditors will absolutely want to look at that.
Yeah.
For sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rick. I hope that provided a good just example of what it really looks like in depth and documentation, and that gives you a better direction and understanding of that. So Scott, could you give us just a little bit of an overview of what the best practices are with regarding and maintaining documentation?
Yeah, certainly glad to. I guess I would boil down the best practices from a line that we use with ISO certification a lot, because as I think everyone knows, ISO and other standards like that require a lot of documents. And they'll say, say what you do what you say, and then prove it. So say what you do means create a document on what you do that, follow that procedure, follow that policy, and then prove it with records and evidence artifacts, things along those lines. So that ports really well over to NIST and CMMC. But I guess from a practical day-to-day point of view, some suggestions would be have a centralized place you're going to keep your policies and procedures. Don't make people hunt for it. Don't let people keep them in their private folders and work areas necessarily. Have a designated centralized place where policies and procedures are going to be kept and kept up to date, which then brings in version control. It's important that you have revision control on these documents. You follow a good disciplined document lifecycle of approval and revisions and things like that. And that would include regular reviews. So not only once you have things in place, you need to be reviewing it on a regular basis, generally once or twice a year, and really make sure that you catch any updates that might need to be made as time goes on. It's important to have ownership of documents. Who's responsible for each document. I know in our core platform that Rick was showing, we designate an individual called an author, the document's author, and they have the editing rights on a particular document. You may not be using core, you may be using some other system, but regardless, you need to make sure the ownership is clear so that you know who is authorized and responsible to make changes as needed. Have standardized way to do things. We provide templates to our clients that kind of provides that level of standardization, not just in terms of format, but in terms of content. And you saw the different topics and sections in those templates. Have a standard way that you're going to document information so that it's easy to create, easy to review, easy to read. People will get used to the format that you're using in your organization. Last couple things, make sure you have training along with your documents. That information in your documents is important. It's certain individuals need to be aware of what's in that documentation. It's not that everyone needs to know everything. So you do have to designate responsibilities, but then make sure you follow through and provide adequate training. And finally, watch over security of these documents. Some of those documents, I'm thinking like configuration management and things like that, are going to have specific information in there pertaining to your network and your system. And if that configuration management policy or procedure were to get out, someone would have information that they might be able to use to compromise your network. So make sure you're maintaining security of these documents, which of course our core platform does for you. But if you're not using a system like Core, make sure you're paying attention to the protection of that information as well. Treat it as sensitive, I guess.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Scott. So we kind of touched on it briefly before, but Rick, could you go in a little bit more depth on what an assessor actually looks for?
Yeah, good question. Everybody's asking, what is the assessor going to be looking for?
Getting
how
into the
difficult
mind.
is it going to be?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough. It's going to be a tough assessment. So you want to have everything in place. It starts with what I would call, what is called a readiness review, where they're going to be looking to make sure that you have implemented a system, cybersecurity system, and that you're meeting the controls. One of the first things they'll look for is your system security plan. We talked about the SSP. They'll be looking for your network diagram, data flow diagram. Some of those documents that we talked about, they want to make sure that they don't go through a full assessment if you don't have things in place. I liken that kind of for those individuals out there that have gone through an ISO audit. If they remember way back when you first got your assessment or audit, you had a stage 1 and a stage 2. The stage 1 was to make sure that you had ISO in place. Well, the same thing is true here. They want to make sure that you have everything in place so that they can continue on with that assessment. So once you get through that, the way it's constructed is they're going to go through each and every one of the practices, understanding that every practice is broken down into assessment objectives. There are 320 assessment objectives that the assessor is going to look at and require you to provide evidence that you're meeting that particular assessment objective. They can look at it from 3 different perspectives. They can look at it from an examination perspective, where they are going to examine documents. They're going to read those documents. They're going to look at it and make sure they understand what you're saying, you're doing. They could interview individuals. Once again, that's important. They'll want to know that, what you say you do, that the people understand, your employees understand what they're supposed to do, and that it matches. So it's very much what Scott said: say what you do and do what you say. And they validate that against employees to make sure they know how to handle a particular situation. And then the last part of that type of question that they would look at would be test. So you have that examine, interview, and test. And that testing methodology, the best example I would have is think of a logon to a application or onto the network. And you say that after 3 failed attempts, you get blocked out of that application or logging onto the network. So they would want to see you fail it 3 times to ensure that it blocks you from that 4th attempt. So that's kind of a test. They're not going to do the testing. They're going to ask you to do the testing. They're going to say, show me that what you say here, after 3 failed attempts, it blocks you from logging on to the network. They would expect you to show that. So those are some of the things they'll look at. Definitely look at your policies. Make sure that whatever we say in those policies we're doing. They will look in areas of your network. If we are saying we have set up least privilege for our standard users, they're going to say, show me that. Let me see how you've done that. So maybe they'll have to go into your GPO, your procedures for that, or say, show me this group policy that you have in place that limits users' accessibility to the network. So they would look at those things. They're keeping notes, documenting everything that they see, so that they can provide a finding. Is it being met or not being met? And at the end of the day, either it's met or it's not met. There's no partial credit.
Yeah.
Back from my teaching days, you get partial credit. There is no partial credit here. Are the controls being met or aren't they being met?
Yeah, so it's a lot, that they go through. An auditor looks through. So platforms like ours that we showed that can automate everything is super helpful. But can you also share maybe some common issues that are found in assessments?
Yes, there are some common failures. I hate to say failures. Roadblocks for you achieving your goal. One of those would be a lack of policies or procedures. You could say, well, I know how to do this, but once again, it goes back, if it isn't documented, are you really doing it? It doesn't exist. So a lack of policies or procedures, or maybe too vague of policies and procedures would be another one. Incomplete or outdated documents, okay? So I created this document for one particular solution, but that solution doesn't exist anymore. So it's outdated. We're not using that platform. Or, we had an on-premise server, now we're using a cloud server. So you need to keep your documents up to date as you move forward. Maybe you don't have certain things for handling incidences, and that nobody knows what do you do if I have an incident. So maybe there is a lack of that procedure. We didn't think about that. So it would be a missed procedure or policy that would be there. Another important aspect is periodically, at least on an annual, semi-annual basis, doing an internal assessment or an internal audit, checking the health of your system. You don't want to wait till it comes time for your assessment to find things out. You want to do that ahead of time, kind of like with ISO. It requires you to do an internal audit. You want to do an internal assessment at least once a year, and maybe you want to break that down. Maybe there's a lot to cover, so maybe you just take bits and pieces. I'm going to cover these controls in this quarter and these controls in another quarter, or maybe you want to break down on a month basis. I'll take these various controls to spread it out over the whole year. But once again, failure to do a self-assessment, to evaluate how we're doing with this. Those are all very important things, but people get so busy with their day job, with what they're doing, that they forget about that.
Yeah.
And so that would be a point of failure for them.
Okay. Wow. That's some really good information, I think, of things just to look at and be aware of. And I like the idea of even just doing it periodically. That makes it a lot easier and less daunting.
Sure does.
So Scott, what are some common challenges that you've found with CMMC documentation?
Yeah, I guess I'll cover a few things just to give some encouragement and direction in terms of setting up things properly. I guess the first hurdle to look at is making sure you really understand the requirement. It's no use trying to write a policy if you misunderstand what's required. And when you look through the NIST documentation, and that'd be the NIST 800-171 and its companion called NIST 800-171A, we've talked about those in previous sessions. Those are very technical documents. They're very detailed documents. And they're pretty abstract. They're very, while I said they're detailed, they're also general, meaning they don't tell you step by step how to do things. They say, here's the destination you need to reach. How you reach it is up to you. So you'll find that if you don't understand what it is you're going to have to demonstrate during the assessment, if you've misunderstood the goal, you'll never write a procedure or a policy that helps you to reach that goal. And it's very easy to get tired to get weary, to get frankly bored with the whole thing. If you try to bite it all off in one big fell swoop,
Yeah.
it's overwhelming. So that's why we spent the time to talk about the importance of training along with documentation, because you got to understand the requirement. Second thing is implementation. So it's fine if you write it down, document what you do, but if you don't do what you say, you don't implement it, you're not following that practice, doesn't matter that you documented what you do. You're still going to have a negative finding in the assessment and would cause you to fail that particular practice.
Yeah.
So you have to follow through, and then that brings us to the third piece, which is maintaining all of this. It's one thing to have things in at the beginning. It's one thing to be focused on it at the start when you're getting everything in place. But then time will go on and you'll get busy, as Rick mentioned earlier, and it's hard to keep up. That's where that annual internal audit or internal assessment really comes into play, or the annual or semi-annual review of documents comes into play. Those types of activities help you to maintain compliance, to keep up with it, because things will change. I mean, technology changes constantly, rapidly. Very easy for you to make changes on your network and forget to go back and change your policy. And so that's a key piece. And then I guess the last thing I'll mention is just the time and cost of all of this. It's evident that this takes a lot of time. I mean, this is why we're talking about something as detailed, mundane as documentation a year before we see the regulation, coming out from the government. It takes time, and getting a head start is important. But planning and setting aside that time is important, and then making sure that you're budgeting properly for the technologies, you're getting the help you need with training or documentation or consultation, making sure that you're planning those things out, because unfortunately, I don't see the government writing a big check to reimburse you. They've been pretty clear that's not going to happen. You can include your costs in your quote. Well, okay, that's fine, but you still have to expend the money. So having a plan, having a budget, not only for preparing and learning and implementing, but maintaining, having those resources in place. It's one thing our customers ask us a lot is, what kind of ongoing help can we provide to keep them on their toes, to keep things up to date, to provide those internal audits or that ongoing training, whatever is needed. But this is something that isn't for the faint of heart, I guess is the way to say it. And you got to plan out, just like any important business function, securing your network and securing these government documents is a cost of doing business with the government. You don't shortchange yourself and then find yourself disqualified from even winning a contract with the government. You go to all this work and not get certified. That really would be you're not going to get the ROI from all this investment.
Yeah. So then do you have any tips as well, Scott, for making documentation not just something necessary, but also useful and practical for your business?
Yeah, a couple of things, Maddie. I won't go into a lot of depth here, but having your documents to be clear, clearly written, not in techno language, in gobbledygook. That's my word for it. Unless it's a technical document and you're only writing for your network engineer, perhaps, or your system administrator who understands that technology and that terminology, then it's fine to have a technical language in it. But if you're writing for the rest of us, use language that's clear and explain acronyms and explain terminology as you go through. making sure that the information is easy to access. I talked about earlier about having a central place to keep it. Be consistent, not only in terms of the way you write your documents, but say the consistent use of terminology. Don't use different words for the same thing. Use one word for the same for a particular idea. You might even create a glossary of terms or a list of terminology that you can refer to as you write your policies and procedures. It's good to create diagrams and visuals and tables and lists that kind of break information down. Sometimes that's helpful. Cross-referencing is helpful. If something is the next step, then go ahead and say, this is the policy you're going to want to look at next. Or if there's a procedure that goes with the policy, make sure that that's referenced clearly so people can find their way around the documentation. So, and I guess finally, feedback. This is kind of a living process, an ongoing process that needs to be improved as time goes on. Give your employees and give others in your organization a chance to give feedback on the documents so that you can make corrections. That a lot of things will be found when people are reading through them, or they're confusing, or inaccurate, or whatever the case may be. Let people give feedback and have a way for that to be done easily and quickly. It's also important.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I think those are good to help just give some insight into how to make the documentation better and hopefully more useful, not just a thing to check off your list, but something to assist your organization as a whole. So I guess we'll move into the Q&A section right now. We have quite a few questions here. Then we'll answer your personal questions right now. So we have one. I know we talked a lot about the similarities of the CMMC audit with the ISO audit, but someone asked, can you combine the ISO and CMMC audits together?
No, they are very, very different audits or assessments. In fact, one group of people do not like you calling the assessments audits, because there's a different feel for those. The NIST CMMC assessment is based on a maturity model, which means they're expecting you to have everything in place and that you've been doing it for a while. Now, what a while means depends on the individual. I like to say it's a routine activity of yours. That you routinely do XYZ, whatever XYZ is, which is a little different than ISO, because ISO is not a maturity model process. There's similarities, but there's also differences. I can tell you the assessment for CMMC, they are going to go into the details. Every nook and cranny, they're going to validate. So it's more than understanding a process. They really are looking for the details.
Great.
Hey, Rick, I would take one other aspect of that is that would be internal audit or internal assessment. Can you combine those? And I think there you have more latitude. You could leverage your internal audit team to do to audit some of your NIST or CMMC compliance, especially the organizational controls. The less technical controls could be done by your ISO internal audit team, I would think. Where it gets tricky is when it's highly technical areas and someone doesn't have a technical background. They're just not going to be effective at doing the audit. But I think for many of the things you could combine when you're talking about your internal audit or internal assessment, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Those organizational controls, the policies and procedures, absolutely would be something that you could leverage as part of that. However, when you get to the technical controls, group policies, where am I going to go to look at that? Well, that's going to be in an application or an API somewhere, or your audit logs through a SIMS product or your RMM tool. those things are very technical and would require that. But yeah, I think there is room for pieces of it.
Nice. Another question we have is, how is the documentation shared with external or other management systems?
Say that again?
How is the documentation shared with external or other management systems?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Scott, do you want to answer that, or you want me to answer that?
Well, I'm trying to make, if whoever typed that in could type in a quick clarification, I would ask, are you asking how would it be shared with external parties? How would you share it outside your organization? Or how are they similar to other management systems? I'm kind of taking the question two different ways. Maddie, let's let that comment come in, and let's go on to the next question.
Okay. How is documentation used during internal and external audits?
Yeah, great question. That it really boils down to the say what you do, do what you say. So what does that mean? An assessor will go to a particular practice or control, and they'll ask about what your policy is. Maybe they'll look at a family at a time. That's a possibility. And they'll want to see your documentation, and then they'll read through it. That's the examine piece that Rick had mentioned earlier. And then, following the examine, you can guarantee the interview piece is coming next, because they're going to want to ask, for explanations and demonstrations and perhaps tests to show that what you've written in the policy, which, assuming the policy is good and adequate, that's half the battle. The other half of the battle is demonstrating that you're actually following it in practice. Okay. So the documentation becomes the centerpiece of the assessment, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then for that previous question, we have some clarification. Yeah. They said maybe the other parties that you work with. So I think like other people, other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you have documentation that external parties are going to need access to, you're going to need to be providing secure access. Again, I remember I mentioned that this should be treated as sensitive information, perhaps confidential information, and if possible, giving people secure logon privileges to the location of your documents would be helpful. If you have to send by email, I would encrypt the email or encrypt the file when it's sent, or send a link to the file. I know SharePoint allows for that kind of a feature where you could send a link that could only be used by the party who receives the link. So just be very aware that this information should be carefully distributed, and you should think through. That question is an important question for everyone to consider. How are we going to distribute documentation if somebody's not within the organization?
We have another good question. So someone put in, my company seems to believe that CMMC is entirely in the realm of IT. Any tips on how to show them that creating policies and procedures is something that the company as a whole needs to address?
Oh, that's a great point. Rick, you want that, or you want me to take it? Because we both have strong opinions about this.
No. Success comes from the top down. We'll just start with that.
Yeah.
And there are certain controls, the organizational controls, that are not necessarily technical in nature. Let me give you one example. Might be you have a facility and you want to put together an escort policy. How do we handle that? That's not necessarily technical. Maintaining locks on the door. Once again, there could be expense for some of that you'd want to work in the budget. Are you going to use a keypad? Are you going to go really high tech and do retinal scans? But no, there are things that from management side that you want to be involved with. Not all of it's technical. Okay. Some of it are procedures, processes that we're going to implement. And you have to be thinking about your workflow within your organization. You still have to do work.
Rick, that's where I would go, Rick, is that it's not just about the technology that
Yep.
handles the documentation, but you have to think about those people who use the documents,
That's right.
whether they are reading or referring to those documents, whether you need to be able to print a document and provide it in your manufacturing environment. Now you have a physical copy of the document that has to be dealt with.
Yep.
You're kind of out of the technology realm, at that point.
Yep.
You've got, you got people who are creating documents, and they're using the technology, but they're also just accessing the documentation. So the people who are involved with that have certain permissions, and you have to designate that. They need certain training, and you have to provide that. So this is every person who has any access to the CUI, any access whatsoever, is within the scope of the assessment, and it's within the scope of your certification. So you've got to think beyond just the technology. And there's I think and we did the study on the technical versus organizational, but it's about 2/3 technical, a third organizational. Maybe it's more 60-40. But a good portion of it is requirements that pertain to everyone, not just the technical folks.
Okay. Then we have one last question. Someone asked, is CMMC based on the same scrutiny as the NIH when they went through the human genome medical records? Are you guys familiar with that at all?
Not a bit.
Not a bit.
I don't know how to answer the question because I'm not familiar with the NIH requirements. But as Rick mentioned, every detail needs to be proved.
Yeah.
Every detail needs to be demonstrated.
Yeah.
And it could be more than one example needs to be provided. So if you take 110 controls, 320 assessment objectives, several examples for each of those objectives, you could be talking about hundreds or thousands of pieces of information that'll be reviewed over a course of several days in the assessment. And I say that not to scare people, but to scare people.
Yeah. Because you're dealing with...
You have to have your eyes open. You have to know what you're getting into because this is a business decision to invest in this certification. It's not business as usual. It is time and money involved. It is a commitment, and it will take management involvement and leadership to pull this off.
Yeah.
Like any important change in an organization, it's going to be an all hands on deck. And is it going to be as much scrutiny as another type of assessment? I haven't been through one this tough before.
Yeah.
But I'm not in the medical field or health field or something like that. So maybe those are harder. I don't know.
Yeah.
This one is big.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Scott. And that's all the questions that we have time for, but we will answer the leftover questions. We will make sure to email you back with the answers to that. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out and email us. We're providing the email soon. But we want to thank you for joining us today. We hope that you feel better equipped to prove your compliance through documentation. Members of our consulting team are available to help you better prepare for CMMC. Our experts are here to help you lay out a plan for CMMC and get your sensitive information secured. If you're interested in more information about our CMMC programs for small business, please contact us at info@thecoresolution.com. Thank you again to all of our co-sponsors for promoting today's event and taking part in sharing this important information about CMMC. I would also like to take a moment to share some more information about Apex Accelerators. Apex Accelerators are a bridge between business and government. They're funded by federal and state sources. They serve businesses of all kinds. It's a nationwide program with 94 centers and approximately 630 counselors. Here's a map of just the ones in Pennsylvania, so you can find out which Apex Accelerators corresponds to your location. Apex Accelerators can help you with vendor registrations and certifications, identifying government markets, and so much more. About the name change, they updated their name in November 2022. It's a new funding source, but still the same clients and communities that are served. Find your local Apex Accelerator at www.aptac-us.org to locate them and contact them. Here's a list of the Pennsylvania Apex Accelerator's contact information if you live in Pennsylvania to get in contact with your Apex Accelerator. Finally, next month we'll be having a webinar on how to keep CMMC affordable. This webinar will explain how to show your compliance, not show your compliance to documentation, that's what we talked today. It will show you how to be able to cut costs and keep it, well, affordable, because as we talk through, it can be quite expensive. Please join us on Thursday, September 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to learn more about keeping CMMC costs down. As we wrap up, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Stay safe and let us know if you have any questions from today's session or would like more information about any of our CMMC programs. Take care.